The shocking truth behind a secret affair and 3 hidden kids. From beneath the veil of a perfect marriage, a scandalous truth clawed its way into the light, threatening to shatter everything. Welcome to a story where whispered secrets spill from the shadows of a picturesque English village, casting a stain on the fabric of my life. I am Emily, and I invite you into the tapestry of my existence, where every thread pulled unravels a lie long interwoven with love. This tale is not just mine, it is a legacy of passion, a chronicle of forbidden desires, and a journey through the heart's labyrinth where the exit leads to the most unexpected of revelations. Prepare for a narrative that dances on the edge of propriety, teetering between the illicit and the intoxicating. So, take my hand as we step into the world that was once my solace, now transformed into a stage of scandal and truth. The letter that turned my world upside down was penned with a secret so potent it reeked of betrayal. Dive with me into the depths of a mystery that begins with an innocent envelope lying amidst a pile of mundane mail. I am Emily, and I never expected a piece of paper to be the key that unlocked the Pandora's box of my family's darkest secrets, but there it was, a silent herald of the storm to come. As you join me on this first step down a path paved with clandestine whispers and the echoes of a forbidden past, brace yourself, for every secret unearthed will challenge the very essence of what I believed to be true. Chapter 1. Secret Letter unearths family scandal that will leave you speechless. It was a damp Tuesday afternoon when my life took a turn into the pages of a scandal novel. There I was, Emily Carter, an editor by trade, a wife by choice, and a skeptic by nature, sitting at my cluttered kitchen table, sifting through the usual mix of bills and leaflets when an unassuming envelope caught my eye. It was the kind of letter that whispered rather than shouted, but its message was about to scream scandal in a way that would echo through the very foundations of my life. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant but rushed, as if the sender was determined yet fearful, a combination that piqued my curiosity more than the bland anonymity of a typed font ever could. To Emily, with the truth, the envelope stated, and nothing more. Inside, a single sheet of paper held words that would unravel me. Your life is not what it seems. The past is a lie, cloaked in secrets. Seek the truth about your mother's romance and discover the family you never knew you had. I laughed at first, a hearty, disbelieving chuckle. A prank, surely. My mother, bless her departed soul, was as ordinary as they came, or so I believed. She was a woman of cardigans and casserole, not secrets and scandals. But the laugh died in my throat as a chill of foreboding trickled down my spine. For years, I'd been content, nestled in the arms of a quiet life with a man who loved me, or at least I thought he did. Our love was comfortable, like a well-worn shoe, not the fiery passion of storybooks, but it was mine, and it was enough. Or so I told myself, as the whispers of that letter began to gnaw at me. I couldn't let it go. It clung to me like the scent of a forbidden perfume, luring me with the promise of a hidden narrative beneath the bland pages of my life. The notion that my mother, the very picture of suburban virtue, could have harboured secrets was ludicrous, and yet, here I was, considering the possibility. I turned to my husband, Mark, with the letter in hand, ready to share a laugh over the ridiculousness of it all. But the words died on my lips when I saw the look in his eyes, the briefest flicker of something unreadable before it shuttered into the usual comforting warmth. In that moment, doubt took root, fed by that unspoken glimmer. What did I really know about my mother? There were memories, of course, but they were child's recollections, simple and untainted by complexity. She was loving, certainly, and kind, but she was also private, a part of her forever locked away. Even as a child, I sensed there were chapters of her life I wasn't privy to, stories she tucked away in the attic of her mind, behind the Christmas decorations and boxes of old photographs. As the evening drew in and Mark retreated to his study, his sanctuary from the mundane aspects of our domesticity, I made a decision. I'd go to the attic, that shadowed place of forgotten things, and look for clues. Climbing the creaking ladder into the dimly lit attic felt like stepping into the past. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light piercing through the small window, each one a tiny beacon in the gloom. Boxes upon boxes greeted me, each a Pandora's box of memories, innocent on the outside, but possibly brimming with secrets on the inside. I rummaged through them, heart racing with a mix of dread and an unquenchable thirst for answers. Old clothes, books, my father's discarded pipe that still held the scent of his tobacco. All these things I passed by until I found it. Her box. It was a simple wooden thing, carved with the delicate roses she so loved, and it was locked. I hesitated, my hands trembling. The lock was a clear statement of privacy, a boundary set by a woman who was no longer here to enforce it. But the letter's poison was in my veins now, coursing with every beat of my heart, compelling me to break the sanctity of the past. With a hairpin and a silent apology to the ghost of my mother, I picked the lock. Inside, the scent of lavender and secrets wafted out. Letters tied with a ribbon, a diary with a worn leather cover, and a photograph of a man I didn't recognize, his eyes hauntingly familiar, stared back at me. I began to read the diary, and with each word, my mother's life unfolded, a tapestry of love, loss, and passion that was as beautiful as it was forbidden. She wrote of an artist, a man who brought colour to her monochrome world, who painted her in strokes of love and left her canvas forever changed. The clock struck midnight as I turned the last page of the diary, my mind reeling. The man in the photograph, the artist, could he be? My thoughts were interrupted by a noise from the study, a muffled curse from Mark, and the unmistakable sound of something being hastily concealed. My heart pounded, not just from the revelations of the diary, but from the sudden, visceral fear of what my own investigation might unearth. I placed the diary back in the box, the letters still unread, the questions multiplying like shadows in the dusk. Tomorrow I would confront Mark, I decided. Tomorrow I would demand the truth. But tonight I would lay beside him, a stranger, my heart a tumult of emotions, and my mind swirling with the tantalizing, terrifying beginnings of a truth I was only just beginning to comprehend. As sleep eluded me, one question rose above the others, demanding attention with the urgency of a siren's call. If the past was a lie, then what was my present? This is chapter 1 of a 6-part short story. If you don't have time to watch or listen to all 6 chapters right now, why not subscribe to the Romance Diaries on YouTube and check back later, or simply stay tuned for chapter 2. The diary of a saintly woman held tales of such smouldering desire it could burn the fingers that dared to turn its pages. In this chapter, I peel back the delicate layers of my mother's past, each entry a revelation more shocking than the last. My name is Emily, and I stand at the precipice of a past painted with the brushstrokes of an illicit affair that scorches the present. What began as a quest for truth morphs into a journey through a hidden life where love and passion are the ink that writes history. As I confront these revelations, I invite you to witness a portrait of love that defies the bounds of convention. Chapter 2. My mother's hidden romance, the steamy affair that shocked me. Who would have thought that the very fabric of my existence was woven with threads of deception? Last night's revelations left me restless, tossing and turning in the bed I shared with Mark, the man whose steady breathing now sounded to me like the hush of secrets. It said that the morning brings clarity, but all it brought me was a relentless storm of confusion. The man in the photograph, the artist, was he my... No, I couldn't even bring myself to think it. Not yet. It was too preposterous, too much like the plot of one of those novels I edited for a living, filled with torrid affairs and impossible coincidences. The house was silent as I made my way downstairs, the first rays of dawn casting long, sombre shadows across the kitchen. Mark was already gone, likely retreated to the sanctuary of his study, that place where I now suspected he kept secrets of his own. I sat at the kitchen table, the diary laying open before me, its pages a testament to a woman I realized I never truly knew. My mother. The woman who had penned these words was full of passion, of longing, of a desperation to be seen and to be loved for who she truly was. She spoke of her love for the artist with a fervour that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. They had met in secret, in the shade of the old willow by the river, in the quiet corners of the village fete, in the attic where I now sat, a silent witness to the aftermath of their forbidden love. The entries were sporadic, written in bursts of emotion that left my hands trembling as I read. Each meeting was described with a tenderness and an intensity that left little to the imagination. Their affair was not just a meeting of bodies, but of souls, a connection so profound that it transcended the ordinary life she led with my father. She wrote of the first time they made love, under the stars, the night air around them alive with the electricity of their touch. It was poetic, almost too much so, the way she described the feeling of his hands tracing the curves of her body, his lips whispering promises against her skin, the sweet pressure of him moving with a rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. I had to stop reading several times, my cheeks flushed, not just with the second-hand heat of my mother's affair, but with a mixture of shame and sorrow. Shame, because I felt like an intruder in her private world, and sorrow, because I saw the reflection of my own unspoken desires in her words. She never named the artist, referring to him only as her soul's muse and her heart's capture. She knew their love was a ticking time bomb, set to detonate the moment it was brought into the light. And yet, she couldn't stay away. I understood that pull, the allure of something, or someone, that promised escape from the drudgery of everyday life. I could hear Mark moving about upstairs, the floorboards creaking under the weight of his steps, each creak a reminder of the reality I was trying to escape. I had to confront him, but first I needed to understand the depth of my mother's deception. The diary ended abruptly, with a final entry that was more a cry of despair than a goodbye. "I have to end this," she wrote. "For the sake of my family, for my children, I must say goodbye to my heart." It was dated just a week before I was born. The realization hit me like a slap to the face. Could it be possible? The timing, the secrecy. Was the artist... My train of thought was interrupted by the sound of the study door opening and Mark's footsteps descending the stairs. I quickly closed the diary and tucked it away, my heart racing with a fear I couldn't name. "Morning, love," Mark said, his voice a balm to my frayed nerves. But I could see it in his eyes, that flicker of something hidden. He knew something about the letter, about my mother, something he wasn't telling me. "Mark," I began, my voice steady despite the chaos raging inside me. "We need to talk." The words hung between us, an invitation to a conversation that would unearth the secrets we both kept. But would we have the courage to face them? The kettle whistled, a shrill sound that pierced the tense silence. I stood up, my legs shaky, my resolve firm. It was time to uncover the truth, no matter how steamy or scandalous it might be. Today, I would demand answers. But as I reached for the teapot, my hand froze. The letter, the diary. They weren't just whispers of the past. They were echoes of my present, of a marriage that might have been built on the very lies I was so desperate to uncover. And the question that haunted me as I poured the boiling water over the tea leaves, watching them swirl and settle, was not just one of heritage or scandal, but of love. What was love, if not a leap of faith into the unknown? A trust that the person you chose to give your heart to would keep it safe, even when the world turned upside down. As the steam rose from the teapot, curling into the air like spirits of the past, I braced myself. I was about to leap, and the ground beneath me was anything but solid. This is chapter 2 of a 6-part short story. If you are enjoying this story, please show us some love by hitting the like button. Please stay tuned for chapter 3. They say blood is thicker than water, but the ink of my mother's secret was enough to dilute the strongest of bonds. Venture further into my story as Emily, where the discovery of a hidden affair spirals into the unveiling of lives intertwined with mine by blood I never knew I shared. Here, in the heart of a quiet village, the whispers of my mother's past beckon me to uncover the existence of siblings who walk unknowingly in the shadow of a shared legacy. Stand by my side as I navigate the complexities of new ties that bind with an intensity that rivals the most ardent of romances. Chapter 3. My Secret Siblings. Mother's steamy affair leads to shocking family revelations. You know, they say ignorance is bliss. Well, I can tell you now that's a load of rubbish. Ignorance is a ticking time bomb, and I was living on borrowed time until that blasted letter blew my life to smithereens. "Mark," I said, my voice quivering like a schoolgirl's, "did Mum ever mention anyone from before? Someone special, maybe?" I watched his face, looking for that telltale flicker, that sign I wasn't just grasping at straws. He paused, a spoonful of cereal suspended mid-air, milk dripping back into the bowl. "Emily, your mum was a saint," he said, with a forced chuckle. But there it was, that flicker. "Why do you ask?" I slid the letter across the table to him, the paper now creased from my nervous folding and unfolding. His eyes scanned the words, and I watched him, really watched him. There was a moment, so brief I might have imagined it, where his facade cracked, like he knew something. "Ridiculous," he scoffed, pushing the letter back. But his hands, they betrayed him, trembling ever so slightly as he reached for his tea. The rest of the breakfast passed in a blur of half-hearted conversation and unmet glances. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to think away from the suffocating closeness of Mark's too quick assurances. I found myself wandering the village, the place where my mother had walked, laughed and loved. The same cobbled streets, the same thatched roofs, and the same old willow by the river, its branches sweeping the ground as if bowing to the weight of its own history. The villagers, they knew me, the good little girl grown into the editor who'd moved back to her roots. But now, as I passed by, I wondered what secrets they held behind their polite nods and weathered smiles. Did they see her in me? Did they whisper about me as they did about her? Mrs. Aldridge, the baker, handed me a loaf of bread, her eyes lingering on mine a moment too long. "Your mother was a lovely woman," she said, her voice laced with something I couldn't place. Sympathy? Pity? Knowledge? I wandered, lost in thought, until I stood before the town records office, an old stone building that seemed to sag under the weight of the stories it held. I pushed the door open, the bell tinkling above me like a herald of the secrets I was about to unearth. The records were meticulous, a paper trail of births, deaths, and marriages. And there it was, my birth certificate. Father, John Carter. Mother, Anne Carter, née Harrow. But in the margin, a note scribbled in a hand I recognized from the love letters, my mother's. "Ask about the Hendersons," it read. My heart skipped. The Hendersons, a name I knew, a family of artists that had lived in the village for generations. Could it be? My search led me to an old, ivy-covered house on the outskirts of the village, the Henderson home. I knocked, my heart in my throat, as the door creaked open. An old man stood before me, his hair wild and white as the clouds above. His eyes, sharp and clear, met mine, and something passed between us. Recognition. "Emily Carter," I introduced myself, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I believe we may have family in common." His expression didn't change, but he stepped aside, a silent invitation. The house smelled of oil paint and turpentine, a scent that filled the gaps in my memory with vivid colour. He led me to a sitting room, where portraits lined the walls, the faces in them as familiar as my own. "Your mother," he began, his voice rough like sandpaper, "was a force of nature. She and my brother Thomas. Well, they were kindred spirits." He paused, his eyes clouding with old grief. "They had plans to leave, to start anew, but then she found out she was pregnant." I felt the room spin, my mother's words in her diary echoing in my ears. "I have to end this," she had written, "for the sake of my family, for my children." Thomas Henderson was my father, wasn't he? The question hung in the air, a plea for a denial that never came. The old man nodded slowly, the confirmation settling over me like a shroud. "And you're not the only one," he added, his gaze steady on mine. "Not the only one." The implications of his words were like a punch to the gut. Half-siblings. This quest for the truth wasn't just about me anymore. It was about us. As I left the Henderson house, the old man's parting words ringing in my ears, I knew what I had to do. I had to find them, my unknown siblings, pieces of a puzzle I never knew were missing. But as I walked back through the village, with each step, a cold realization crept in. The artist, the village hunk my mother had loved, he had a son, one who had left the village only to return years later. A son named Mark, my Mark. The truth was a twisted vine, and it had been wrapping itself around me all my life. And now I had to untangle it, no matter how painful the process. As I reached the door to my home, my sanctuary, I hesitated. Inside, Mark was waiting, the man I loved, the man I married, the man who might be my brother. The next words I spoke, the next actions I took, they would change everything. I took a deep breath and opened the door. This is chapter 3 of a 6-part short story. If you would like to experience your own real-life romance, possibly not exactly like this one, please visit our sponsors in the description below. Stay tuned for chapter 4. In a moment of madness, I surrendered to an embrace that promised to erase the chaos, if only for a heartbeat. My name is Emily, and I confess to seeking refuge in the arms of a man who was not my husband. This chapter is a confession, a raw and unfiltered glimpse into the tumult of a heart caught in the throes of a maelstrom. As the fabric of my life unravels, join me in the reckoning of a moment's passion, a diversion from a reality too crushing to face. Together, we'll walk the razor's edge between fidelity and desire, between the sanctity of marriage and the escape found in another's. Chapter 4. I slept with the village, hunk and don't know if I should tell my husband. You'd think growing up in a place where the biggest scandal was Mrs. Cooper's prize rose going missing, I'd have learned something about dealing with secrets. But nothing in this quaint English village life prepared me for this, for the searing possibility that my husband might be more than just my partner, that he might share more than just my bed, but my blood. The day was cruelly ordinary, the sun casting a mocking glow over the flowers in our garden as I grappled with the newfound knowledge of who Mark and I might truly be. I wandered through the village like a ghost, my body moving on autopilot, while my mind raced with the revelations from Mr. Henderson. There's something you should know about me. I've always prided myself on being sensible, on keeping my head when all about me are losing theirs. But in that moment, with the ground of my very identity shifting beneath me, I did something utterly senseless. His name was James. He was the kind of man who could set your pulse racing with just a glance, the kind who seemed to stride through the pages of a romance novel and into the real world. The village hunk, they called him. He had always been just a fixture of the village to me, a part of its charm. But today, as he stood there by the baker's shop, tipping his hat with a smile that could melt butter, he was a lifeline. "James!" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. He turned, that ever-present smile widening as he saw me. I walked towards him, my heart pounding, my mind screaming that I was about to make a terrible, terrible mistake. We talked. He was easy to talk to, always had been. But as the words spilled from me, confessions of the turmoil within, his eyes changed. They darkened with something like understanding, like recognition of the pain that was coiling tight in my chest. And then, it happened. We were walking along the river, the same path I'd wandered 100 times with Mark, and suddenly James's hand was on mine. His touch was electric, a jolt that set my senses aflame. Before I knew it, we were at his place, a small cottage just outside the village, and I was in his arms. I won't go into details, some things are sacred even now, but it was as if I were outside my body, watching as I sought solace in the arms of another. It was madness, a moment of pure insanity, driven by the fear and confusion of the secrets that had uprooted my life. When it was over, I felt hollow. James was kind, too kind, his eyes holding questions I wasn't ready to answer. I left without a word, my skin still tingling from his touch, my soul heavy with the weight of my betrayal. Now, as the evening closes in, I'm sitting at the edge of our bed, mine and Mark's, and I'm wondering if I should tell him. Would it make a difference? Does my infidelity pale in comparison to the possibility that our marriage is something out of a Gothic novel? The front door creaks open downstairs, and I hear Mark's familiar footsteps. My heart is a drumbeat, loud in the silence of the room. What do I do? What can I say? He's calling my name, his voice steady and sure, the voice of the man I married, the man I thought I knew. I stand up, my legs trembling, my resolve crumbling. I have to tell him, about James, about everything. But as I take a step towards the door, I stop. There's another truth that I've been avoiding, a truth that sits heavy on my tongue. The realization that in the arms of another, for just a fleeting moment, I felt free. Free from the secrets, the lies, the unbearable truth that threatened to suffocate me. I take a deep breath, and as I open the door to face Mark, I know that this is the moment of truth, the moment where all the secrets come pouring out, where the facade of our life together falls away. But as I step into the hallway, Mark is there, and he's holding something, a letter, addressed to me in a handwriting I don't recognize. "Another one?" he asks, his brow furrowed. I take it from him, my hands shaking, and as I read the words I feel the ground beneath me give way once again. It's from her, my mother. A letter, written before I was born, confessing everything. And as the words blur before my eyes, one line stands out, a line that chills me to the bone. Mark must never know the truth about his father. The letter slips from my hands, floating gently to the floor as I look up at Mark. his face a mask of confusion and concern. The cliff I'm standing on is crumbling, and I'm about to fall. This is Chapter 4 of a 6-part short story. We would love to know what you think of the story, so please let us have your comments and feedback. Stay tuned for Chapter 5. The truth, once a slumbering beast, now stood before us, its eyes glowing with the fire of revelation. Embark on this pivotal chapter as Emily, where the wait for a truth that binds my husband and me in an unspeakable way comes to a close. Every second ticks by with the weight of a verdict, and the air between us is charged with the anticipation of a life-altering disclosure. The DNA test is a key that will unlock doors we may wish forever remained closed. Stand with me as we face the consequences of secrets sown in the soil of a bygone era and watch as they blossom into a reality that demands to be acknowledged. Chapter 5. Scandal explodes, facing the shocking reality of secret half-siblings. The room spins, a carousel of confusion as Mark's eyes meet mine. The letter lies between us, a testament of truths untold, and suddenly the walls of our home seem to close in, whispering of sins and secrets. "Emily, what is this?" Mark's voice breaks through my daze, a lifeline thrown into the tumultuous sea of my thoughts. I grasp for words, any words, to anchor me back to the moment, to explain the inexplicable. It's from her, Mark. From my mother. My voice is a stranger's, hollow and distant. There's something about us. About our families. The truth threatens to choke me, each word a stone heavier than the last. His hand trembles as he picks up the letter, scanning the lines, the creases in his forehead deepening with every word. "About my father?" he echoes, a note of incredulity in his voice. "What does she mean, Emily?" I look at him, really look at him, at the man I've shared my life with, my dreams, my bed, the man who may now share my blood. I think we might be more than just husband and wife, Mark. The air between us is electric, charged with a decade of shared history, now tainted with doubt. He takes a step back, as if my words are a physical blow, as if the space could somehow distance him from the truth. "Emily, are you saying—" He can't finish the sentence. He doesn't have to. "Yes," I whisper, the admission tearing through me. "I think we might be half-siblings." The silence that follows is deafening. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece is a metronome to our shock. I watch as the foundation of our relationship crumbles in his gaze. The love that I thought was unshakable now questioned in its very essence. This can't be. Mark's denial is a desperate plea to a cruel universe. It's a mistake, a sick joke. But deep down, we both know the truth isn't something that can be wished away. It's in the letter, in my mother's diary, in the knowing glances of the villagers, in the very air we breathe. We stand in the wreckage of our marriage, the life we built together, and I feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on us. What do we do now? Where do we go from here? The questions multiply, each one a path leading into darkness. And as if in response the letter rustles on the ground, as though it, too, is uncomfortable with the truths it holds. Mark runs a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and confusion. We need proof. A test. We can't just accept this without... He doesn't finish his sentence, but he doesn't need to. I nod, the practical part of me latching onto the idea. Yes, a test. DNA. Something concrete to hold onto amid the storm. We'll do it, I say, the decision solidifying within me. We'll get a test done. And as we agree to seek out the undeniable truth, I can't help but wonder if some truths are better left buried. But the genie is out of the bottle, and there's no turning back. As the evening stretches into night, we sit in silence, lost in our own thoughts, together yet more alone than ever. The past has intruded upon the present, and as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realize that regardless of what the test says, our lives will never be the same again. The irony isn't lost on me. I sought the truth to free myself from the shadows of my past, only to find that it may cost me my future. And as I drift into a restless sleep, I can only hope that whatever the morning brings will find the strength to face it. But even as I close my eyes, a part of me knows that the biggest test isn't the one that will come with a swab and a lab result. The real test is what comes after, when we have to decide what life looks like when the dust settles. Because no matter what, the Mark I love, the man who's been my everything, he will always be Mark. And not even the most shocking truth can erase the years of love, laughter, and tears we've shared. But can love survive a revelation like this? I guess we're about to find out. This is Chapter 5 of a 6-part short story. If you are enjoying this story, why not subscribe to the Romance Diaries, where you can enjoy other stories of love, romance, heartache, revenge, cheating and betrayal, and by clicking on the notification bell at the same time we can let you know every time we bring out a new video. Please stay tuned for the final chapter, Chapter 6. The universe has a cruel sense of humour, revealing that the man I called husband was bound to me by blood first. In this final chapter, I, Emily, confront the staggering aftermath of a love that must now transform under the unforgiving light of truth. The revelation that Mark and I are more than just soulmates, that our connection runs deeper than vows, deeper than years of shared memories, is a tide that washes over us with merciless certainty. Journey with me through the heartache and the healing, as we navigate the uncharted waters of a relationship reborn from the ashes of a devastating truth. Herein lies the end of a chapter, but not the story, for life always finds a way to continue, even when the path takes turns we never expected to tread. Chapter 6. I found out that I was married to my half-brother. In the pale light of dawn, the world seemed muted, as if holding its breath. The journey to the clinic was silent, a void where once there would have been chatter, or at least the comfortable silence of familiarity. But that was gone now, replaced by a chasm that Mark and I didn't know how to bridge. The sterile smell of the clinic was a sharp contrast to the warm, earthy scent of our garden back home, where our biggest concern used to be whether the roses would bloom well this year. Now, as we sat in the cold waiting room, even the roses seemed like a distant memory. The nurse called us in with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She knew, they all did, why we were there. In a village like ours, news travels faster than the wind. A DNA test. A confirmation of a shared parentage that was too horrific to contemplate. We didn't speak as they took our samples. The clinical efficiency of the process was almost offensive, reducing our shared history, our love, to a few milliliters of saliva in a test tube. As we walked back to the car, I couldn't help but think of all the things that had brought us here, the threads of fate that weaved a tapestry so intricate and so tragic. Back home, the wait began. Days stretched into an eternity, each one layered with the same routine, devoid of the warmth we once shared. We were like actors in a play that had long since ended, not knowing how to leave the stage. The roses began to bloom, a splash of colour in a world that had turned grey. Mark busied himself with tending to them, lost in the petals and thorns. I watched him from the kitchen window, a pane of glass between us that felt like a wall. And then, one morning, the call came. I held the phone in a shaking hand, Mark's eyes locked on mine. "Yes, this is she," I managed, my voice a whisper. The voice on the other end was gentle, apologetic, but the words were a sledgehammer. "Yes, I understand. Thank you for letting us know." The phone slipped from my hand, bouncing on the couch, its beeping tone a distant echo. I didn't have to say anything. The truth was written all over my face. We were siblings, half-siblings. The test was conclusive. The silence that followed was a living thing, pulsing with the shock and grief of our newfound reality. Mark reached for me, his hand trembling, and I met him halfway, our fingers entwining. In that touch was a world of love, of pain, of memories that were now tainted with the stain of blood too closely shared. "We can't." His voice broke, and with it, the dam inside me burst. "No, we can't." Tears streamed down my face, mirroring his own. "What do we do now, Mark? Where do we go from here?" He pulled me into his arms, the embrace of a brother, the comfort of a husband, all rolled into one. We clung to each other, adrift in a sea of loss and confusion. The days that followed were a blur. Lawyers were consulted discreetly, options laid out with clinical detachment. Annulment. It was a word that tasted like ash, a word that unravelled the fabric of a decade of marriage. But amidst the legalities and the logistics, there was a thread of something else. Hope. Not for us as husband and wife, that was a dream that had died with the ringing of a phone, but hope for us as people, as family. We decided to face the world together, as siblings, as friends. The love we had for each other hadn't changed. It had merely shifted, morphed into something different but no less real. The decision to part was mutual, a bittersweet resolution to a story that had started with such promise. The annulment papers were signed with a solemnity that was almost ceremonial, a quiet acknowledgement of the life we had shared and the new lives we were about to begin. I decided to leave the village, to seek out the other siblings that my mother's diary had hinted at. It was a quest for connection, for understanding, for a family that was suddenly both smaller and larger than I'd ever known. As for Mark, he stayed. The village was his home, the place where his roots ran deep. He would continue to tend the roses, those bursts of colour in a world that could still be beautiful, despite everything. On the day I left, we stood in the driveway, the car packed with a life condensed into boxes and suitcases. Mark handed me a single rose, a deep crimson that matched the colour of our shared bloodline. "Goodbye, Em," he said, his voice steady. "Goodbye, Mark." I took the rose, the thorns biting into my skin, a poignant reminder of the pain that comes with love. As I drove away, I looked back in the rearview mirror to see him standing there, a solitary figure among the blooms. Our story was over, but new chapters were waiting to be written for both of us. And as the village faded into the distance, the open road ahead whispered of beginnings. Beginnings that came not with the heat of passion, but with the quiet strength of acceptance. And perhaps that was the greatest love story of all.